So basically, they talked about this $100,000 deal that Combs made with the security guard. What does that play into, and why is that so important?
This is such a pivotal piece of testimony. Why? So, one of the big crimes that Combs is charged with is racketeering conspiracy. In order to prove racketeering conspiracy, that he was operating this criminal enterprise that was engaged in a pattern of criminal activity, there are a number of underlying predicate crimes, and the prosecution has to prove at least two. One of them is bribery. So if the jury accepts the fact that he paid $100,000 that was ultimately split between different parties in order to obtain surveillance footage, and not surveillance footage of him going to the market, but surveillance footage of him allegedly beating up Cassandra Ventura, which the prosecution has already used as evidence to suggest that was an example of sex trafficking, then it is bribery to obtain evidence of a crime. And that is a very, very serious allegation. But when you hear that testimony and you couple that with the paper trail and the money trail, that is going to be a pivotal piece of evidence for the prosecution to prove bribery. Again, one of the underlying crimes of racketeering.
What problems did the defense have with this testimony?
So the problem with the defense for this testimony is this is a guy who clearly does not want to testify. Yesterday, Eddie Garcia came forward and said, I want to invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. He had to be granted immunity. Why? Because he testified that he lied to law enforcement. He testified that he didn't report this payment. And in a way, he's basically saying, yeah, I committed crimes to cover all of this up. And he's not putting himself in any advantage by admitting this. He has no loyalty or allegiance to Sean Combs. That goes to his credibility. So it makes it more likely than not that what he's telling this jury about this payment circumstances surrounding it are true. It's interesting. The defense seemed to try to suggest that Cassie, and look, there was evidence to suggest that, Cassie had knew about this payment, had agreed to this payment. So that kind of helps them, helps the defense to suggest, oh, this isn't Sean Combs, trying to cover up evidence of a crime where Cassie is the victim, but she was a participant in this, that Combs was actually trying to protect both himself and her. But at the end of the day, it goes to the larger point about what was happening in that hotel. And remember, the prosecution has said that she wasn't necessarily just leaving that event. And remember, she wasn't testifying that she was just leaving an intimate affair with Sean Combs. She claimed she had just left a freak-off. Prosecution says she was leaving a crime scene. So that would be, so it makes it even more important what happened in that hotel. Something that she initiated, that we saw in evidence from text messages that she said she wanted to be there at the hotel that night for a freak-off, which she in her testimony said she did that so she could pacify Sean Combs and he could make her life easier for the premiere. So there is that sort of dichotomy you have there of her essentially saying at one point, yeah, this is something I want to do, but on the other hand, I'm playing sort of a reverse psychology role here just to pacify him and hopefully have a good night for something that's really important to me, which is that premiere. This is not a clean-cut case. This is not a clean-cut prosecution. It's complicated, and the jury has to weigh whether or not she is not telling the truth about her consenting or lack of consenting to all of these freak-offs, whether really she is doing this because of some personal reason against Sean Combs, whether there was a financial motivation, maybe there's embarrassment, or what the prosecution says, that she really didn't consent to any of this, that she felt she had no choice to participate in these events, to set them up, to pay for them, and that it maybe took years for her, and particularly through therapy, to understand that she was a victim of this. And there are clearly complicating factors based on the testimony of Dr. Dawn Hughes, this forensic psychologist, who basically said when you're dealing with a victim-abuser relationship, there's trauma bonding, there's financial control, there's all sorts of reasons why it may appear like someone is behaving inconsistent with being abused, but that might not be the reality of the situation. Was there any other highlight you saw from Garcia? By the way, Eddie Garcia is another witness who's mentioned Christina Corum, Sean Combs' purported former chief of staff. If you're talking about a racketeering case, about a criminal enterprise, to have somebody who was around him all the time and knew the ins and outs, and who's already been mentioned as being whether a knowing or unknowing co-conspirator in a lot of this, you need her to testify. And for her to be the person that first contacted Garcia, allegedly, to get a hold of this footage, it makes it seem that she may be not only one of the most important witnesses of this case, but maybe the prosecution is going to be saving her testimony for the end, to really tie Combs to racketeering activity. I believe that if she does testify, she was probably granted some sort of protection or will be granted some sort of protection, but because she has been named so many times and brought up by the prosecution so many times with assistance and Cassie Ventura, I think they are building her up. So when the jury finally hears that Christina Corum is taking the stand, they will already know who she is. So let's remind people, Christina Corum was chief of staff for Combs. I'm not sure if we know how many years she was involved with this, but all people reported to Christina, essentially. People not only reported to Christina Corum, she was the one who was in constant contact. She was the one who was allegedly always contacting Cassie Ventura or reaching out to people to get a hold of Cassie Ventura because Combs wanted to stay in touch with her. So if the idea is that Combs had control over Cassie, alleged victim number one, and controlled all aspects of her life and couldn't let her go, she becomes a conduit of this. And you also wonder, what else does she know about Sean Combs? And if you're talking about a racketeering conspiracy, a criminal agreement, you wonder, is she one of the people, one of the unindicted alleged co-conspirators in this case? Because for racketeering conspiracy, Combs had to have come up with a criminal agreement, not himself, with someone else. Is she the person? We'll wait and see. So the second half of today kind of laid out this organizational chart of how did the Combs Enterprise, Bad Boy Enterprises actually work? So what the defense did was they showed all the different companies that Combs had, and they showed the CFO, the COO, et cetera, et cetera. But what they didn't show was the people who are closest in Combs' orbit that the prosecution wants to paint as unindicted co-conspirators, the people who are granted immunity, the people who are carrying out all of these crimes on his behalf. So that was what they made sure to point out to the jury. I thought Mr. Ferguson's Oh, sorry. I thought Mr. Ferguson's testimony was important, right? It was important to establish the money flow. It was important to establish the paper trail. How did money come out in terms of the expenses and in terms of credit cards, and how was cash handled? And he seemed to be surprised that members of Sean Combs' security had ultimately carried cash, because you want to know who was paying for the freak-offs, who was paying the alleged sex workers, how was money being handed to Cassie Ventura, particularly if the defense is suggesting she was a willing participant in setting up these events. And it did become really interesting under cross-examination, where the defense was suggesting, look, because of the deals that Combs was entering into, they would have had to look at the books. Companies would have had to look at the books. If this really was a criminal enterprise, wouldn't he be hiding this kind of money? And by the way, because of the partnership with BMG, they owned Arista, 50% of Bad Boy, he couldn't just have unlimited access to the money to further his criminal enterprise. And really where they got to it, in case the jury was confused, they asked Mr. Ferguson, can you provide any evidence that Sean Combs' alleged sex trafficking or sexual abuse was benefiting the company in any way? Remember, criminal enterprise. Sean Combs' activities, all these activities together were benefiting a criminal enterprise. Were any of these alleged crimes benefiting, providing money to the company? And he said no. And I think that was a really, really important point for the jury to hear, because they may still have questions about racketeering. They may still wonder how each witness actually matches up to the elements of the crimes. Have you seen any evidence that the company benefited from any of these crimes? I can't see right now that any of his companies financially benefited from any of his purported crimes. It's more of a nebulous concept. It's more of a general concept that we've seen in the indictments and basically what's been alleged so far in this trial. That if Sean Combs was benefiting, if his sexual desires were being fulfilled, if he was getting what he wanted, then the companies and his clients and the music, they would all benefit. It's all about serving, as by the way, David James, a former assistant, had testified, it's all about serving Sean Combs' kingdom. If he's benefiting, everybody else is benefiting as a result. I think that's the way the prosecution has ultimately structured this case. Not as if it's a classic mafia case where the family is, gaining prestige and power and money, but it's to serve Sean Combs as the head of this criminal enterprise. And I think right now the prosecution has presented a lot of evidence of racketeering, forced labor, arson, kidnapping, sex trafficking, drug offenses, whether it's Kid Cudi's testimony or Capricorn Clark or Cassie Ventura or David James, or even Mr. Garcia today. I think it all lends to this idea, building up to the narrative that he was essentially a leader of a criminal organization. And it doesn't mean that there have to be bylaws or a charter, everybody signed an agreement to commit crimes together. But this idea that he was essentially like a mafia boss committing all these different crimes to serve his own interests, that's what I think they're doing. In the last minute that we have, Jane is likely to take the stand tomorrow. What can we expect from her? They say voluminous amounts of text messages are going to be released. The most so far. What is she going to testify to, do you think? So Jane, alleged victim number 2, is arguably the second most important witness in this case, right? Because her testimony, like Cassandra Ventura, doesn't only make up the racketeering charge. Combs also faces one specific sex trafficking charge with respect to her. So whatever she says could corroborate Cassie's testimony and vice versa, but she really, really has to provide the prosecution with evidence that she was coerced into these freak-offs and sexual episodes, that Combs used force and violence and threats and intimidation and financial control, very similar to what Cassie testified to engage in these episodes. And also whether or not videos that may or may not be shown of her engaging in this activity, if Combs is directing her and you can see on the videos that she's doing things against her will and that she's uncomfortable, that is what the prosecution needs to sell this case of sex trafficking of alleged victim number 2, of Jane, to the jury. All right, well, she'll be there until we think maybe next Wednesday, so we shall see. Jesse, always appreciate you.